What do you think are the most important takeaways for CEOs to consider when they're trying to build brand recognition?
I would say that the most important thing to focus on early on is frankly messaging. I don't think that's changed. I think it's really important to have a very clear voice. How do you want to be perceived in the marketplace? Really understanding your obviously your target customer and audience exceptionally well, so you're speaking their language, and then ultimately making sure that what you're saying is unique, it's relevant, and it's defendable. I think sometimes from what I've observed, there's been a lack of maybe attention to get that part right before kind of going out and announcing something or trying to generate media interest or engaging on social media. If you don't have that differentiated message and tone and language early on, then I don't think any amount of marketing campaign or push is going to be very effective at all.
What do you think are some of the misperceptions that executives who don't work in marketing have when it comes to implementing marketing and PR, or they're not implementing it, but when they're asking their teams or their agencies to implement PR and marketing plans, what do you think are the misconceptions that people run into?
Yeah, I think one of the bigger ones that I've encountered both at small and large companies has been the misperception that you need to get into the larger publications, like the national, and well-known publications, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Fortune, what have you. When in fact, I think the truth is that I think a lot of people, especially economic buyers, are actually looking more to individual bloggers and individual contributors or professionals or experts first before they're kind of looking at these larger publications. And I think that also relates to the other misconception, which is really measuring the success of marketing or comms on the amount of views or the amount of web traffic that's driven to a website. My view is that quality over quantity should really be the name of the game when it comes to communications. So I think having laser focus on that initial point that I made earlier on who your target audience is and what do you want them to hear is really, really very important, more so than just driving eyeballs to your website.
How can VCs, PE firms, et cetera, you advise companies like that? How can they support their portfolios in terms of marketing and PR? What approach should they take? Should they come in and just try to take over, or, how can they support in the best way?
I would say from my experiences, I think it has a lot to do with relationships and people. And really, from what I've seen work best is when, private equity or venture capitalists, really give founders or, companies a platform to share their point of view. I think there's a part of just the opening up your network to the founders, I think is a really, really powerful thing right now, because like I said, there's so much noise in the marketplace right now that, it's really difficult to reach people. Right. And then as far as like how to engage, I basically, in my own experience, have served almost like as a matchmaking, provider, a dating service, if you will, for, founders and marketing agencies, and trying to orchestrate the right fit is really important, because the wrong fit can really cost a lot of time, value, a lot of time, money.
When do you think, from your experience, a rebrand is the right thing to do? And when do you think that it's more just like a patchwork, changing a color of a logo versus something really meaningful?
I would say my biggest kind of qualm is when a new marketing, exec is hired, and the first thing they want to do is, change the website. I'm more of a function over form, marketing and product exec. I tend to look at, is the brand serving its function, right? Meaning, if you were to, kind of close your eyes and imagine, the Nike brand, what comes to mind? I think you'd imagine the swoosh. I think you'd imagine the shoe. I think you'd imagine, maybe, Colin Kaepernick, of recent. And so in their case, their brand is still, functioning right correctly. What I've experienced is when, the brand is no longer serving the function. So maybe the go-to-market has changed. And so I worked with a portfolio company not too long ago where, really the entire company, culture, vision, product, really transitioned to become more of a tech company than, say, a professional services company. And so for that reason, we were able to extract elements from the, original brand, but ultimately modernize it so that it served the new function to appear more relevant to a technical audience.
What recommendations would you have as companies have to decide what to cut and what not to cut? Are there certain things that are just an absolute must? Are there certain things that, well, it depends? Or if there isn't a general answer, then what questions should they be asking themselves as they need to make these difficult decisions?
Depending on what stage you're in, that'll ultimately help really kind of focus where to put your money and resources and people's time. And so that's kind of that's kind of one frame to look at it. But more specifically, look, I think it's actually not a bad thing. I mean, there's a lot to be said that when resources are scarce, you tend to use those resources much more effectively. And I think, interestingly enough, my advice would be that, at least in the marketing profession, there's been a big shift to frankly work more with advisors, or what's called fractional CMOs, than necessarily hiring a full-time CMO, because the marketing profession has continued to evolve and expand so much that people, like, for example, you can have a chief marketing officer who is an excellent comms person. So if you're getting ready to go IPO, that's crucial, right, for that moment in time. But if you're very early stage company, you probably don't need a full-time, CMO at that stage, and probably you shouldn't have one, because, the product still hasn't necessarily found market fit. And so really what you probably want is more of a product marketing, like, CMO, who can really help you position the product, very early on, so that new customers who don't have any idea who you are can quickly kind of, place you somewhere in their head to know, exactly what you're doing. The only other thing I would say is that, yeah, content is, really important. So to continue to produce content, stay active on social, but on a very individual kind of personal level, I think is the key.
I believe that you're pretty passionate about product-led growth.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of insights or tips or anything for people who are just starting to get into it?
I've seen it where people have tried to launch, PLG, kind of, experiences, and have fallen flat because, frankly, they just ignore a gaping hole in terms of, user friction, and they've kind of waved over it and said, well, we'll get to that, after we do all these other things in marketing, like update the website, all these other things, because there's pressure to generate demand for sales, right? So my advice would be really to give PLG, the attention it deserves early. And if that means that, you're going to take a hit in terms of demand, which I know is sacrilege to say for a marketing executive, I think it's necessary, frankly, to get it right. The only other advice I would say is that I think there's there's a misconception, or there has been, but I think it's changing, that product led was a substitute for salespeople, and it's just not. In the B2B world, you absolutely need to have sales involved, because the truth is that the end user is less likely to be the buyer, right? The economic buyer. And if you're selling in a B2B tech, oftentimes they can't just swipe a credit card. There's no one size fits all kind of answer for product led growth and how sales and marketing work together. I think it's really a collaborative effort that, establishing that process early of what constitutes really a product lead, how you instrument the product so that the data flows to the sales and marketing team so they can optimize and create much more personalized engagements, and so on, I think is really, really critical to get right. And it's hard. It's really hard work. And so that's why, I say it's not a one size fits all. You really need to kind of workshop it and test and find out the right, process for your business.
For B2B, how important are analyst relations?
I feel like analyst relations have been important historically. Yet I feel like the tide is changing a little bit, where venture capital, and PE firms are actually really investing more in putting out guides, if you will, or as an analyst would, right? Like an analyst used to put out like a buyer's guide, or they put out their magic quadrant. I feel like there's a changing of the guard, where VCs, or like I said, PE firms are actually now starting to put out similar things. I still think it's important to, especially on the enterprise side, right? So on the B2E, absolutely, CIOs, CPOs, CEOs, really on the enterprise scale. Oh yeah, if you're not engaging analysts, then you won't even be in consideration. Period. If you're selling into an enterprise, company, analyst relations are still very much crucial to even get a seat at the table, right? But I would say that there's new people emerging, new experts emerging, that you also probably need to engage. Venture capital is investing in its people to really stand them up as industry or product experts. Like Tomasz Tungs is a good example. Unusual Ventures has some folks that they're talking a lot about PLG right now, and that's getting sent around the ecosystem quite a lot.
Right. That was awesome, Joel.